Hey everybody, I want to talk about this quilt, but I'm going to start talking about this quilt. This is Bohemian Rhapsody. This is my first Rhapsody quilt. Now, when I made this quilt, all I was trying to do back then was to try to find a way to do applique by machine that I liked. I struggled with satin stitch. I think that's a really difficult technique. And in general, I try not to do things that are difficult. And I know that can be crazy when you look at some of the quilts like Bohemian Rhapsody and you think it's extremely difficult. The truth is, it's not. So on this quilt, I was experimenting with the center medallion just to make that little sort of Hawaiian style applique in the center. Once I discovered the stitch that I like, the quilt wanted to be bigger, so I designed it a little bit bigger. And then it said, nope, I want to be bigger. So I made it bigger, and ultimately I figured out a formula to make the Rhapsody quilts, which in turn became a book. So I love teaching this process, but I also realize that people working on their own may fall short when it comes to design, especially if they don't have guidance. So I started creating patterns, and Fleur de Vie is one such pattern. I want to demystify this process for you, and my primary reason is to teach you that this way of quilting is honestly fairly easy, even though it looks very complex. So, number one, the process is of course creating the design, but the templates are really fairly large. They're not like little 2-inch half square triangles. These are large pieces that are going to get appliqued. And the way I do this is I cut out the piece with freezer paper. I then iron the freezer paper onto the fabric, and I do a stay stitching that goes around the edge. The stay stitching will be our sewing guide later, and it's also stabilizing some of the edges if they're on the bias at this time. The process of using registration marks and including those registration marks into the seam allowance is going to help us stay accurate as we sew these together in the future. Another thing that I do that is quite unique is I'm not using a 1/4-inch seam. When I trim these down, I trim them to slightly less than 1/4 inch. I could tell you 3/16, but the truth is I'm not measuring. I'm just looking and making sure that it's less than 1/4 inch. Because when you're sewing curves, less than 1/4 inch will sew together easily. And less than 1/4 inch will hold your quilt together forever and ever. Amen. Trust me, I've done this for 20 years, and you just make sure that when I say less than 1/4 inch, I don't mean 1/16 of an inch, because of course that gets too small. Now, when the pieces are finished and up on the wall, they're background pieces. They're not joined together. Nobody makes a Baltimore album quilt and starts with 20 white squares, sews the 20 white squares together, and then starts appliquing on one of those squares. You do your applique on one of those squares, and when all of your blocks are finished with the applique, that's when you join the blocks together. And a Rhapsody quilt is exactly the same. You're simply going to take your background pieces, do your applique, and if you love to do it by hand, that's not a problem. I will be teaching my double blanket stitch technique. You could also use a single blanket stitch, but it's very user-friendly and it's very forgiving, and I've got some great tips and tricks that teach you how to do that. So you get your applique done, it's all done, the quilt looks great, and now it's time to simply sew these pieces together, not using a 1/4-inch foot, not using 1/4-inch seams, and more importantly, not using pins. And that alone sounds crazy, but all I'm doing is matching the stay stitching of the top piece onto the stay stitching of the bottom piece. I'm going to be stitching just barely inside that stay stitching line and matching the registration marks as I go. I'm telling you, it's a really easy process, way easier than many quilts where precision is uber critical. So I encourage you to consider now Fleur de Vie, because Fleur de Vie is kind of like right now my hallmark design. I have kits for this that are ready to be pre-ordered. And then yes, not only do you receive the fabric, you get the pattern, but also I do have video tutorials for the techniques. All of the individual techniques I will provide to you because you have the kit, and that's an extra bonus that comes with getting the kit. I should also add that I'm planning on this pattern to add some alternative applique options. So if there's one particular applique that you don't care for, but you care for a different one, you can shake it up and your Fleur de Vie quilt could be a little bit different than the one shown here. I hope you'll join me on this fun project. I'm looking forward to seeing you soar and do things that you never thought were possible. And this quilt, this is the quilt that I'm going to prove to you you can do something you never thought you could.